All right, hello to everyone here and out there. I see that we already have one question. Since there is no handout, will the PowerPoint be available later online for note-taking or review? My understanding, although Dick has disappeared, is that yes, it will be available. So let's go ahead and start. I am Katie Chenoweth. I will be talking to you today about teaching language with, not through film, and the distinction between those two things should hopefully become clear as we go on. So just a word about the inspiration for this talk and what led me to be giving it to you. As a graduate student, like most college and university language teachers, I was teaching French. I'm in the French department. And then I spent 2 years following my experience as a language teacher, teaching film and media studies. And when I returned to teaching language classes, I found that I wanted to teach film in a very different way than I had when I was teaching language without getting into the film studies and of things. So what I'm going to hope to do today is share with you some of my thoughts on how you can integrate sort of the basic principles of film studies and film analysis in the language classroom. So let's go ahead. All right, so the first question before we even get into film studies per se is why teach language with film? Why use film in a language classroom? A few really important reasons. To begin, students arrive in the classroom with high levels of interest and motivation as readers of film, which is another way of saying they like film, they watch film, they know what film is and what it's about, right? So it's more so than with other types of materials, I would say. You're going to have students excited to be using film, watching film, talking about it. Next, film helps fill in understanding through its visual conventions, genre, and narrative structure, right? Its unique sort of multimedia nature is going to allow students to understand language at a much higher level because there are visual cues, conventions, other narrative techniques that are going to guide them through that. Finally, film's many layers of signification increase students' sense of competence, comfort, and motivation, right? Something that's really unique about film, especially sort of Hollywood-style narrative film, is that sound, image, the way the film is shot, all tend to be mutually reinforcing one another. So everything they're hearing, or everything that's coming in linguistically, has a sort of support system that's reinforcing it in other media and through other senses. In short, students are already conversant in the language of cinema. They may not be self-conscious users, speakers, readers of that language, which is what is part of the goal of this talk today, is how to make us feel more competent as self-conscious users of that language so that we can allow students to be, but they're conversant, right? This is a quote that to me was particularly important as I was doing research in preparation for this talk from an article precisely on pedagogical uses of cinema in the language classroom. When pleasurably immersed in the narrative, imagistic, and linguistic flow of the cinema, students' affective filters are arguably lowered with greater language acquisition potential as the result. Right? And I think this is huge. Students are comfortable with film, and that automatically is going to increase what you can do with them on the level of language. Okay, so why not teach language through film? Sorry, I see that we have a question. Are we going to be able to get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? Yes, definitive yes. We will be able to get a copy. All right, so why not teach language through film? And what do I mean by through film? I think many of us, if not most of us, or all of us, already use film in the language classroom, right? So that in and of itself is certainly not novel at this point. But I think the tendency, at least in terms of what I've encountered in textbooks and in terms of what I was taught myself as a graduate student, is that we use it as a vehicle sort of to deliver language. It's just another way of exposing students to language, maybe an especially authentic one, maybe one that has more potential for talking about character and plot, but we really are passing right through film as a medium and going to the language, right? Film is serving as a vehicle for the language, and we're not attending to film in its medium specificity. right? So when I say teaching language with film, what I mean is doing precisely that. Dealing with film as a medium, which is a visual medium, a sound medium, right? And not merely a vehicle for language. So in fact, as I'm talking today, I'm going to deliberately not be talking about any of the things that I think we're used to doing with film. I'm not going to be talking about using dialogue. I'm not going to be talking about plot. I'm not going to be talking about character. I'm not going to be talking about themes, because I don't think you need anyone to tell you how to do that, right? We're already doing that. I'm going to be dealing with formal and aesthetic analysis more than anything. So why not teach language through film? Film is itself like a language with its own grammar. The reason that I bring this up is for, I think, the very important pedagogical point that when you get into doing real film analysis and understanding this language and grammar of film and its formal and aesthetic dimensions, what you're doing is reinforcing the very skills that your students need in order to be effective users of a foreign language, right? Teaching film as a language is going to reinforce teaching French, Spanish, Italian, German as a language, right? So analyzing film is doing what we're already trying to do in the classroom, developing communicative competence, skills in critical reading, and cultural analysis, right? So reinforcing, sort of doubling up on those very same skill sets. In addition, and this is sort of my own personal investment in holding this workshop, neglecting film's medium specificity and formal elements means underutilizing a valuable pedagogical tool, right? Film gives us so much, and I think in the language classroom we tend to use so little of it. And my analogy for this is buying the $900 super deluxe Swiss Army knife with 141 functions and 87 tools and using it as a nail file, right? So hopefully by the end of the talk today, I will have helped all of you understand, and I know I helped myself in the process of preparing this presentation, better understand how to use some of those other tools, right? All right, I'd like to pause for any questions just at this point before we dive into the actual formal analysis stuff.
Do you use the script of the text too? I mean, because like you're talking a lot about the visual, but then you talk about reading. So is the script a support? Or are you going to get back to that later on?
So the question, just for everyone else, was do I use the script, right? Because I'm talking more about the visual dimensions. In the exercises I'll be talking about today, they will not involve the script, the screenplay of the film, its verbal dimension at all. Largely because I think that that's probably what most people are already comfortable doing and already doing. And so I'm deliberately turning our focus away from that. But it would be really interesting, and I'll welcome comments on how to then maybe bring the screenplay back into it in combination with some of these. But great question. The sound is a bit blaring, I hear them saying, Joey. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and continue with my blaring voice. Okay. Oh, well, here we go. What if I don't have any formal training in film analysis, which is a question I knew if I were in the audience would be in my head if I were not myself. So I want to say that above all, doing good film analysis requires being a good reader. Right? And we are readers, probably more than anything else, speakers and readers, and those skills will serve you very well. In fact, they are the most necessary skills. Similarly, skills in linguistic and textual analysis translate really well into film analysis. I think it's not by coincidence that most of the earliest film studies programs in American universities, at least, came out of English departments. Right? They weren't in art history departments where people were doing visual analysis. They were in English departments, right? So there's a very strong overlap between linguistic skill and film analysis skill, even though some of that will need to translate into the visual realm. And finally, film terminology, especially when it's thrown around by film studies students or professors or film geeks, can seem really daunting and off-putting and technical, but I would like to demonstrate, hope to prove to you today, that it's not actually that daunting, and that hopefully you'll walk away today with some good film terminology under your belt. So here we go. Our three sections that we're going to be dealing with today are reading images, and we'll talk more about what that means, the reading of images, sound and image, and then editing. So to begin, our first section here, reading images. Bonus points for anyone who knows what film this is from. It's Mastroianni from Fellini's 8½. All right. So the three elements of reading images that I'm going to be talking about are mise en scène, cinematography, and genre. So mise en scène is quite simply the staging of the film. It's a term that's borrowed from theater. Of course, a French term that still means essentially directing in the realm of the theater. But it's everything that's been placed in front of the camera, right? So before the cameras are ever turned on, in preparation for the filming, we have mise en scène. And I'd like to take a moment just for a little bit of brainstorming, very basic, here in the room and out there. What are some elements of mise en scène, right? If this is the definition, what's going into mise en scène? Use of space, lights, props, totally. Background, right? The sets. Blocking, absolutely.
Actors, if necessary.
Actors, right? So largely things that are borrowed from the theater, that which in cinema resembles the theater. So just to go through, location, slightly different from sets in terms of construction, right? Set design, costumes, makeup, props, actors, acting, style, sort of a vague term there, lighting effects. Right? And there were some other good ones I didn't even mention that came up. Great. Right, and then so sort of the next step in creating the film visually, cinematography, right, the actual techniques of photographing, of taking what you've put into place, right, the mise en scène, and turning it into a film. Elements of cinematography, the choice of the camera, right, what kind of camera makes a big difference in terms of what the film looks like. The angle, the framing, right? So you've got your arrangement of your scene, but then what's the frame? Lighting, arrangement, part of mise en scène and cinematography both. The film stock will make a huge difference in how it looks. And then, of course, camera movement, right? And some of these are more technical than others, and I certainly won't be going into all of them, but some basic things hopefully we can recognize. So I want to start by looking at some film stills. Here we have a still from Double Indemnity, and I'd like to call out from my group present what some things are that you notice right away about the mise en scène and cinematography of this particular still.
Camera angles down below.
Yeah, camera angles down below looking up. Right, we know not only what to focus on in the scene, but we're maybe even finding out something about this character and about narrative because we're looking up at him.
Divided personality. It's not clearly a good figure. Dark.
Oh yeah, we can see moral ambiguity because he's half light and half dark, and that'll be sort of a trade lighting of the genre of film noir, right? Is that lighting where instead of having fully lit characters, we get that stark contrast. I see from the questions, right, he's in the light, she's in shadows, absolutely. Absolutely, right, again, which is going to give us narrative information in addition to developing the chiaroscuro, right, compositional style of stark light and dark.
The gaze on the gaze, like her.
Yeah, the play and overlap of gazes between the characters. She's looking sort of right at his back. He's looking, what we would know if we were watching this film is that there's in fact a third person in the room, right, that they're both looking at and she's hiding from, right? But we don't even need to know that in order to already make a lot of sense out of the mise en scène and cinematographic elements of this shot. And I'd like to contrast this now to The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, a film made 20 years later, and what are some immediate elements of mise en scène and cinematography that stick out in this image? The color, right?
Then
We can tell we're in a feminine realm instead of the whiskey glass that we had Fred McMurray holding in the previous shot. Now we're in the realm of flowers and pink, right? Now we have the classic Hollywood, this is a French film, but what's associated with the classic Hollywood three-point lighting. Right? We don't have any of those shadows that we had in the last film. Right? And now, so just to contrast these two, narratively, almost the same thing is happening. We're in a domestic scene, we have someone coming into a room and someone else is already there. But the arrangement of the shot, elements of lighting, color, the use of space, props, present us with two radically different scenes, right? So we don't even ever have to watch these movies or know anything else about them to read these images in this way. So just to give us a few more examples, I'll be contrasting a few more shots from film noir movies, classic film noir movies from the 40s, and The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Here's one. We have a femme fatale, who we recognize very clearly with her close-up, her cigarette, her big shoulder jacket, right? Again, she's shot just slightly from below, contrasted with the first shot we see of Catherine Deneuve in The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, right? We know right away these are two very different characters. Here we have a rainy street shot in Orson Welles' The Third Man. No, he didn't direct that, I apologize, he starred in that. Contrast to The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, a rainy street. Here, what's the major thing that's creating the difference between these two shots? People versus using shadow and camera angle is huge, right? You get that film noir askew, right? So you're uncomfortable looking at film noir. You can't quite tell what's going on. You can't quite orient yourself in space. Contrasting that to the heavily narrative musical melodrama we have going on in the second shot.
One is forbidding, one draws you in.
Yeah, one is forbidding, the top one, the other draws you in, right, the second. All right, so another major difference between what we've been looking at here, film noir versus our Hollywood-esque musical melodrama, is just a question of genre. Right? Certain genres will have these visual conventions that allow you to understand things about them almost immediately, and that your students will understand almost immediately. And you can exploit genre to enter into way more complex things very quickly because we already understand something about our characters, a femme fatale versus the innocent young girl whose heart is going to be broken, not to spoil the ending. Right, so here's our definition of genre, just shouting out what are different genres? Standard Hollywood genres. Romantic comedy, action, drama, horror, science fiction, chick flick. Yeah, absolutely. These are going to be here just some of the very traditional ones. We've mentioned, I think, almost all of those, right? Your sections at Blockbuster or on Netflix. Right, those are genre. And we don't think of those as being necessarily important categories in terms of how we see and understand and make sense of what we're seeing, but they're huge. They're framing the way we see and what we understand about what we're seeing. So, using mise-en-scène and cinematography in the classroom, how do we do that? So one major category that I'd like to talk about is using film stills to generate language. In one sense, that's exactly what we've just been doing, but I want to talk about some ways to do that in more language-targeted ways. Compare, contrast stills or scenes, also what we were just doing. Look at some more targeted language ways. And then finally, reading an image, doing formal or cultural analysis. Before I get into talking about this in detail, I'd like to pause and talk about what we can learn from film stills, right? And so we don't even have to watch a scene, we don't even have to watch a film in order to be doing really good work and understanding really complex things, I think, right? So here are two stills from the 1967 film Contempt. In the first, on top here we have a visual metaphor between here, our heroine, who happens to be Brigitte Bardot in shadow, and this statue. And now, after we've seen this one, when we see her husband turned away here, we understand that their relationship is falling apart, which is exactly what happens in this scene. Hopefully you get that, and I'm not reading too much into it from my love of this movie, but we can create humor just through a still, right? We have the tiger in La Chinoise eating the woman in the hat here. Mere just sort of composition of the bodies here is humorous. Cultural references and intertexts. Here, I think in Almodovar's obvious reference is Marilyn Monroe, but also Andy Warhol with his use of color. We can also get a verbal visual pun. The image, I hope, is coming up clearly for you here. This is a still from Vertigo. She's inside the frame of a door here and a frame, which of course draws our attention to her. But within the context of the story, we also come to realize that she's being framed. We think she's being framed for a murder, and then she ends up also being the one framing Jimmy Stewart, who's watching her. So the frame, right? Very sort of cinema inside level pun, but a pun nevertheless, all being done at the level of the shot, right? Or here, the still. There's Jimmy Stewart watching her, and we'll come back to them in this scene later. Finally, the artist Cindy Sherman, the American photographer, seized on this enormous power, evocative power of the film still in her late 70s series, Untitled Film Stills. These, in fact, belong to no movie. There's no movie from which these are stills, but she called them film stills, right? Recognizing that we immediately understand or think we understand something about these characters, their lives, the genre of film that they're in, right? And these are all, of course, her, right? She did these series of self-portraits of herself as various film characters. So back to the classroom. I'm going to give an example of an activity I did last week to teach the French subjunctive to my students using the film Amélie, or rather stills from the film Amélie, right? So what I gave my students were certain expressions of emotion to start, which in French you have to use with the subjunctive afterwards. Just gave a few suggestions, and then we dove into film stills. Right. So here she's at the cinema, and they had to generate their own sentence. How is she feeling about something? Right? They came up with sentences like, she's happy the movie is good, she's glad her boyfriend isn't there, things like that. Right? Very basic, but then, right, she finds the old jewel box. How does she feel about that? Right? These tremendously evocative compositions can do a huge amount of work for you, and the students understand immediately, although they might understand different things, and that's where it becomes interesting. Oh, how did you read this? Oh, how did you read this? And we're already operating at sort of a high level of visual analysis and interpretation while they're using the subjunctive. Here they had to decide, you know, it was always something with the boyfriend for almost everyone, except someone thought she was angry about her haircut. Here we introduce a new character, Nino. Right, so just one example of a really simple activity, but where all I had to do was find what I thought were evocative film stills, and then they were off and running with it.
Katie, just out of curiosity, how's the subjunctive coming into that?
Oh, well, in French, it's that, right, she is happy that, and then if there's another subject, right, the film, and then in French you have to say, is good. That second is using the subjunctive. Elle est contente que le film soit bon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sure. Right, so, all right, so an activity I did last semester, and this was with a more advanced class, was looking at two scenes that are adaptations of the same novel. Right, so the 1961 film La Princesse de Clèves and the 2008 film La Belle Personne are both adaptations of La Princesse de Clèves, the Princess of Clèves. And, sorry, I thought I saw a question coming. And so we watched the two scenes. They had seen all of one movie. They just saw a scene from this movie. I didn't know if it mattered. You could probably use just the scenes. They hadn't read the novel, right? And then they just described for each scene, right? And so we're going back to our elements of mise en scène, cinematography, the setting, the costumes, the actor's performance, the camera movement, the lighting, the pace, and then the overall aesthetic. And they were able to do it with no previous discussion of film studies terms. No, I mean, they were in and they were ready to do it. And then through the discussion, we got into more sophisticated analysis.
What level is it?
I did that in my 261, so that was our advanced language class. Yeah, and I see I have a question. All right, so 2 questions. Where, how do you choose the film stills? Well, it's a little bit arbitrary. It tends to be films that I've seen and that I like, but not always. Sometimes I'll go looking for, a Google image search of a certain emotion, and then that'll lead me to something else. I'll know that I want something from a certain period, and I'll go looking for that. It really doesn't have to be highly motivated, although sometimes, right, it can obviously be very beneficial to use it in conjunction with a cultural lesson. I'm going to be showing you a scene from Casablanca, and I'm teaching right now on France and Northern Africa, so Casablanca works really well there. And I see the second question, do the students see any clips from these films? In the example that I just showed, I did not show any clip. We just worked with the stills. They were stills from many different scenes throughout the movie. I didn't know what it would add in that particular instance to show a clip. So no, just the stills. And they were producing all the language. All right, so there's our Princesse de Clèves. Of course, another really interesting layer to add on to this would be then to have them read the scene from the novel, the same scene, and talk about how each director, how each film adapted it differently. La Princesse de Clèves, okay. Sample activity 3, read the image. And in a lot of ways, this is the most difficult, I think. So here we have an image, once again from Vertigo. The lighting on this is not allowing you to see very well, but Jimmy Stewart is peeking his head in here. Here's his eye, right? That's his top of his jacket, right? And here we have a mirror, which you can tell better from the reflection if we had a slightly better image. And so we can ask things like, where's the camera positioned, right? Do we as spectators identify with one character over another because of this position? What role does the mirror play? Really basic stuff, but just sort of looking at the image and trying to understand what it's doing. What's the gender dynamic of this scene? I think a pretty good question given that we have a woman, a man, right? And the play of gazes. Which brings us to, right, what relationships of power or desire are at play here, right? Both between these characters and then all of a sudden us as viewers. Right, so this kind of reading is taking you much more in a film studies direction. And once you're doing this kind of work, oops, Skype, go away. Oh no. Joey, I might need your help here in a sec. Once you're doing this kind of reading, you're really more doing film studies in the language than using the film as a pretext for language. Right? So sort of ascending in the levels of language. All right. Okay. So now, as a synthesis, I would like to give you a chance to try doing some of this on your own. So I'm going to show 2 images, which were the publicity stills for 2 recent French language films. One, this was French and English, Certified Copy in 2010, and White Material in 2009. And I'll keep toggling back and forth slowly between these images, but I'd like to take about 5 minutes and do a 2-part activity here. The first part being what elements of mise en scène and cinematography are evident to you here, and what are they telling you? And then second step, how might you develop the use of these particular stills into a language activity? So I would love it if you could break up here and at your sites into groups of 2 or 3 and discuss those things. And I'll keep going back and forth so you can see both images. You lucked out. You lucked out. I can't, only because I can't manipulate the PowerPoint from here. But I'll go back and forth.
What was the first question? What is the mise-en-scène?
What elements of the mise-en-scène and cinematography do you see in each? Or genre, for that matter. I didn't mention that. So what elements of mise-en-scène do you see? And then how might you develop these images into an activity in a language classroom?
Mise-en-scène is the staging.
So, rural settings.
Yeah. She is
Is she looking this way or is she looking back?
She's looking, so the road is like this, and she's looking, yeah.
So she's not.
It's close up. There's color. Again, shadow. She's highlighted in the front, so it's dark. Yeah, again, I think it brings, it brings, her face is definitely in the center of the thing. And she's not looking at all towards the camera, she's like profile, she's not even facing. See, it looks like she's lost. She's not going anywhere. You think she's waiting for something? Yeah, maybe she's just distracted. There's no expression. You know, it's just a blank. You have a big long rows and things. Right. And again, you just get green, brown, and you put it and make them see.
Oops. Do not analyze that image.
Well, that's how people makes the contrast. Here, I mean, although she's focal point, red clearly is crucial.
Yeah, the extreme light and dark, chiaroscuro. Yeah.
Again, yeah.
Just, which is, I think, Latin, or Italian, which is light, dark. Yeah, chiaroscuro. All right, so let's take about 1 more minute to get ready to share.
You really just only do a Google search to find these pictures?
Well, I watch a lot of movies, but there are a lot of film stills out there. There are a lot of, if you go to a review of a film, it'll have an image like this. Yeah, there are a lot of really high quality images now too out there.
I've been working with some short film producers, and they've been sending me stuff.
Oh, cool.
But a lot harder just to go hunting for still.
I do a lot of screen captures with my DVDs. I do that too. Yeah.
Different quality.
It is. It is.
story, right?
All right, so shall we go ahead and come back together? And for those of you out at sites, please go ahead and hold your comments, and then we'll hear some from this group, and then I'll go ahead and open it up, and we can get some coming in the chat. All right, mesdames, messieurs, revenons ensemble. Okay, so let's hear both what you were saying. Well, let's maybe start with mise en scène and cinematography. What elements you were picking out of these images?
Okay, well that would be part of the assignment, right? We give them the mise en scène. We noted a woman alone, the camera farther back, a rural setting. She's in the center of the road. She's undecided. She's not looking forward. So you want to hear our exercise? Or?
Yeah, well, wait, let's go ahead. You were talking about this image.
That one, sorry.
Right, so we had the description of the mise en scène for this image, and then what would you do with it after you've had the students describe those things?
Well, we'd have a worksheet, and on that worksheet, a series of questions with increasing difficulty. So give the character a name, an age, describe her, make up a place, and also her sort of social status. Then what are her plans? Where is she going? Where is she coming from? What are her choices? What is she feeling? We would do that with the other woman as well, and then we would bring the two together, and they would, for each one they'd have to write in a couple minutes a short story in their groups, and then their groups would come together and there would be some sort of dialogue between the woman and this woman. So they could, would be like, where have you been? Up in Wales, whatever it is, they would come up with some spontaneous dialogue at the end.
I like that. Just to very briefly summarize what was said in the microphone here, have Reading making a worksheet with a character sketch and giving her a backstory, essentially, and then do this for each character, and then write a short story about what's happening for each one, and then bring them together, create an encounter between these two characters. That sounds great. I'll go ahead and welcome more comments here, but I would also love to open it up to those of you at other sites. Please send us via the chat your comments, suggestions, things that you noticed about these stills, and also potential activities. What did some other groups here brainstorm?
I think it leads to a discussion. I mean, maybe they would do some writing just to get their thoughts. I find stills is a way to open discussion, because one student will see one thing, one student will see another thing, and that together can start generating, well, why did you see that, or how do you view that? Experience like this on the road, and anyway, that was the second picture is a little bit more maybe complicated.
So the suggestion here was to have students brainstorming their interpretations, and because there will necessarily be a variety of interpretations, generate discussion based on those differences.
I think it really just level they're at. Like, if I'm at an intermediate level, you have to build up their confidence and using with the smaller questions working up to the discussion. In advance, I would have less of a problem just plunking the picture in front of them.
You can ask them to write 5 questions. Use the interrogative words. When, why.
Let me go ahead and repeat these for our visitors out in the world. So the comment was at different levels, right, there are going to be sort of different types of activities you can do. At an intermediate level, do you want to sort of lead them into those kinds of readings through more specific questions about, say, who is this character, what's her name, what's her age, what's her social status, before you just leap into reading the image cold. Right? Although, Monica, you were adding to that.
You can ask them to write 5 questions.
That's great, right? So at even a beginning level, they could write 5 questions that they want to ask the character, right, as you're learning those interrogatives. Terrific. Nothing from the chat? All right. All right, terrific. I'm really impressed at what you've had to say about these. So let's barrel forward into sound and image. Again, bonus points for being able to place this still. Singing in the Rain. Yeah, it's Singing in the Rain. This is the film within the film. Here's Gene Kelly, right? 1950s film about the transition from silent to sound. So just a brief historical note here. Before sound film, invented in 1927, there was sound in theaters, right? But we had mostly live musical accompaniment, often stock music such as Sinister Theme here. We have our live pianist playing along. The only verbal component to cinema at that time, of course, were intertitles, right? And I'm showing these because we'll be talking about them again later on. Famously, Murnau's The Last Laugh in 1924 used no intertitles and told his story of this man who works in a hotel exclusively through images, and it's amazing. Here are a few comments, contemporary remarks on the arrival of sound. We have the jazz singer here, famously in 1927, the first talkie. I'm just going to read these out. The talking picture is not a rival of the silent picture. The silent screenplay of today is too big and fine a medium of dramatic expression to fear its destruction. A little overconfident. Talking pictures will never displace the silent drama from its supremacy. Talking pictures are here to stay, but they will not replace entirely the silent pictures. 2 years from now, I would not hazard a guess as to which will be more popular. Cecil B. DeMille. And finally, Eisenstein, famous silent filmmaker and theorist. I consider the so-called all-talkie, the film with conversation from beginning to end, nothing but rotten trash. Right. And part of the reason I wanted to emphasize this is to put us back in the mindset as we watch film of spectators of silent cinema, and to understand film as a medium that had this entire other life before words ever came into it. And that if we return to that place, we can generate a lot of really interesting meaning and language from it. So let's talk about the components of film sound. Very basic. I'm sure that you could have generated these on your own: dialogue, sound effects, and music. Right. Dialogue. Film has been described as a verbocentric art post to 1927, right? The way that sound is edited, even the way that films are shot, really place the emphasis on dialogue, right? It's always turned up higher, right? If you have a film where the music is writing over the dialogue to the extent that you can't hear it, you know you're watching an art film, right? That's not a Hollywood film. That's not how sound is edited. Sound effects have a few really basic functions: defining location, lending mood to an environment, portraying the environment's impact on the characters, and also lending realism, right? If you see a film where somebody closes a car door and there's no noise, you know that something weird is going on too, right? Film music, famously the theme from Jaws over on the side here. Actually, okay, so I've said establishing setting, but I'd like to generate from you some of the things that film music does for us as spectators. Creates an emotion, huge, yeah.
Memory. So memory through leitmotif.
Oh yeah, leitmotif, memory often associated with a certain character, as in Jaws, right? Jaws is totally Wagnerian, right? It was in fact, famously the story, maybe apocryphal, is that they couldn't get the mechanical sharks to work. And so they decided to just use the music instead to give you the sense that the shark was there. So because of the technical breakdown, we have one of the most famous uses of movie music ever. Other things that film music does? Let's take a look.
I think it is a transition too at times.
Yeah, absolutely, right? This a way of getting you from one place to another, from one time to another, transition. Yeah, the personality gives us a sense of interior life of the characters. Right. Establishing setting, mood and atmosphere. You've evoked almost all of these. Interacts with narrative by reinforcing or foreshadowing it. inner lives or emotions of characters, contributes to our emotional experience of the film, unifies otherwise disconnected images, right? So most notably in like a montage sequence, right? We have a song and that carries us as we move from different times and places. And encourages spectator absorption, right? And this is famously in the Hollywood narrative system, you want to be absolutely absorbed in what's going on. And if there's a moment when characters aren't talking, you stay with the film because the music allows you to stay in the moment. All right, so the concept I would like for you to take away from the discussion of image and sound most today is the idea of an audio-visual contract, right? So we've gone through these three components of sound film, but what I'd like to really emphasize is the way that sound and image transform one another, right? They're not merely both there as these two media elements of film, right? But they actually transform one another. Right? In the terminology of the film theorist Michel Chion, sound adds value to the image. Right? What you see when you're watching a movie is not just what you see, it's what you hear. What you hear actually changes what you see or how you perceive what you see. Right? Quote from Chion here describing the way they affect each other as contamination and projection. So I'd like to watch one clip with you where I hope to demonstrate the way in which this is true. So let's pull up our first clip from Vertigo. So we're going to watch this 2 times, the first time with no sound, and then the second time with sound, and remark upon the differences. So Vertigo silent first, yeah. You should not be hearing sound. Here's the shot we've already seen. All right, and now we'll watch the same 90 or so seconds but with sound. Sure. Hilariously, it was about to be without sound a second time. of just background noise. Here we go. All right, so I'd love to solicit from you now what changed for you in those two viewings. If anything, was it exactly the same? No, no. The mood, in what way did the mood change?
It's very sad.
Very sad with sound.
It's clear that it's very sad. He clearly loves her. There was a moment where they could have pitted, and that moment is lost.
Where visually it seems like it could be a moment of danger, the sound clues us in to the fact that it's a love scene, it's sad, that he loves her, right? So all of a sudden the characters have these interior lives, and it's giving us genre almost, right? Or at least heavily the mood of the scene. Terrific. Did it change what you saw, right? So we talked about the way it changed what you felt, but did it change what you saw? I'm seeing nodding.
Without sound,
It's interesting. So
The opposite. With music, I pay more attention to her.
But she's
all right, so the discussion here is that without the music, you're paying more attention to the technique of the filmmaking. You're much more aware of the movement of the camera. Whereas with the music, all of a sudden, you're focusing on that character. You're much more involved in the narrative, we could say. Yeah.
yeah, I thought the Zoom felt less ominous, but related to the character.
like a revelation.
Yeah, with the emotion.
Right, so the zoom was ominous when it was silent, and then it almost appears as a revelation when you have the music, right? It casts it in a very different light. One thing that, I won't go back and replay this, but one thing that's maybe even more evident with a slightly brighter screen is that the moment where the Kim Novak character is in profile, right, there's actually light that sort of comes up, right, like all of a sudden a swell of light, and it's perfectly in sync with the swell of the music, and you barely notice it. Strangely, you barely notice an increase in light when you're just watching it, and then all of a sudden together, there they are together, as if, and this is the mutual reinforcement, right, of sound and image. And now for something completely different. Oh, I see a question. Is there a conscious preference for American movies, I'm assuming by me, or is that accidental or because your students might be familiar with them? I can see definite advantages to using films in the culture, body language, et cetera, from ours. The films that I'm showing you now, I chose American films so that everyone in the room could understand them, and that there would be more of a chance of having sort of a familiar cultural context. But in my own classroom, I would use almost exclusively French or Francophone films, with the exception of Casablanca, which is set in France, and if we're talking about the colonization of the Maghreb and the American presence during World War II, so historical reasons. But yes, in my own classroom, I would use French or French language films. Yeah. And now for British film, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You can bring that up for us, Joey. Actually, we could probably even just go ahead and stop it there if it's not going to pick up. They're just going to talk about coconuts now. We can, well, we'll let it play out.
Halt! Who goes there? It is I, Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon from the castle of Camelot, king of the Britons, defeater of the Saxons, sovereign of all England. King of the Britons. Pull the other one. I am, and this is my trusty servant Patsy. We have ridden the length and breadth of the land in search of knights who will join me in my court at Camelot. I must speak with your lord and master.
What, ridden on a horse?
Yes.
You're using coconuts.
What?
You've got 2 empty halves of coconut and you're banging them together.
So, we have ridden since the snows of winter covered this land. Through the kingdom of Mercia.
Okay, we could probably go ahead and stop it there if you don't mind.
We found them.
Or here, I could even do it myself. All right. There's a little bit more to go, but I'll go ahead and do that. All right, so why did I show you this scene? It's probably not a scene I would show in the language classroom, although I have used it in classes on the relationship between sound and image. Right, so the joke here is obviously that the sound is structuring your vision and leading you to anticipate a certain image, right? So I think there's probably no clearer exploitation of the relationship between sound and image, right? This is a joke about movies. This isn't a joke about knights. This isn't a joke about coconuts. This is a joke about Foley artists who, in the post-production moment, create the sound effects for films, right? And so the fog, very cleverly used to hide the arrival of the man pretending to ride a horse in the coconuts, right? So it totally turns this relationship that we anticipate between sound and image on its head to humorous effect. But the only reason it's funny is because we're so trained to hear and see and want what we hear and see to match up for us. So yeah, let's go back to the presentation, please. Well, maybe, yeah. All right. Okay. All right, so this has also been termed the audio-visual illusion, right? And I would say that Monty Python is doing a really good job of playing on and doing something to break apart the audio-visual illusion for us, right? The sense that we have when we watch movies that what we hear is coming naturally from what we see and not from speakers on the side of the room, right? And we locate when someone speaks on screen, we feel like we're hearing that come out of their mouths, but of course it's coming from a totally different place, right? But we automatically do that matching, right? We cognitively help the film become coherent when it is not, right? And most of Hollywood narrative film has been designed to help us maintain that coherence, to help us remain absorbed. The other thing I'd like to mention sort of our other major conceptual piece of thinking about sound and image is the idea of sound film as a palimpsest. And just a brief explanation of the term palimpsest for those who might not be familiar. But this is a term from medieval practice where you would have a piece of parchment or vellum that you would write on, and because these were very expensive animal skins, and maybe you wrote something that you don't really care about anymore, but you really need that parchment, you really need that vellum, you would get rid of the writing, and you would be able to write on it again, usually chemically, or they'd scrape it off inconveniently, although conveniently sometimes when you wanted what was written before, it would gradually reemerge, right? So over time, the text that had been underneath would reappear. So when I'm talking about a palimpsest, I'm talking about something that is layered and where one thing has been covered over on top, but the other thing still kind of pokes through even though you've attempted to erase it. So when I mentioned sound film as palimpsest, it's the idea that the sound has been layered over what is otherwise a silent film, and that you can always sort of go back and find that silent film beneath the sound film, and that there are many moments in films where we don't even realize it's happening, that silent film, that sort of layer underneath, makes itself more perceptible than at other times. So let's go ahead and watch a clip from Rear Window. If your mouse is giving you trouble, Joey, I can also do that. Here. All right, so another Hitchcock film, just for demonstration purposes, Rear Window, another Jimmy Stewart. That was not all of the clip, but that's all right. That's enough for us, right? So we can see that we had the Jimmy Stewart character sitting in his window watching this woman in another window. And this clip goes on actually for a very long time, that he's watching her, and all we can hear is the music, right? But the window gives a pretext for what is essentially a silent film being played out for us and for Jimmy Stewart. So how do I go back to the other? Uh-oh, my mouse just stopped working too now. Oh, is that you or me? Okay. They're vicious. They can't both work at the same time. Mine is not working, so maybe I'll trade you. Thank you. All right, so now using sound and image in the classroom. The three suggestions that I'm going to make, the sort of three conceptual suggestions, are play with the post-production nature of film sound to let students add their own value, right? So when I talk about adding value, we're looking at the ways in which sound, music in that instance, but certainly also dialogue, in addition to sound effects, can essentially reshape the way you perceive the film, right? But because sound is added on usually after the fact, although of course dialogue is often taped at the same time, you can allow students to participate or feel like they're participating in the creation of the film by adding sound onto images, right? So splitting apart the sound and image essentially and letting students take over the sound component. Exploiting or dismantling what we've seen, the audio-visual contract and the audio-visual illusion, and essentially utilizing silence and the silent film that's sort of hiding there underneath the sound film. So I'll give a few examples because that might seem a little bit abstract of what I mean. All right, so sample activity 1, which is taking advantage of the post-production nature of sound film. Casablanca, in fact, I might go ahead and skip this clip because I'm assuming, has everyone seen Casablanca? Is this a known enough film? All right. It's a film with a dialogue that's a very intense, sort of classic Hollywood style. You see the woman, you see the man. It's a dramatic moment. They love each other, but they can't be together. She's about to get on a plane, right? This is what's happening. You can take a scene like that, and in fact, I'm doing this tomorrow right here at 8 a.m. with my intermediate class, we've stripped off the sound. I might show it to them once in English and without telling them what we're going to do, so they've sort of seen it. They have a little bit of a sense of the scene. They probably won't have seen it already. And then we come in here, and the pretext could be something like, this film was sent from the United States to Morocco because they wanted to show it there in Casablanca, but the sound didn't come with the image, and now it's up to you to dub a new version of this scene. And then they have to make their own versions. And here at the TMC, we have the capability of actually creating a film where students can dub their own soundtrack, and it creates a file that they have where they can watch it and hear their own voices filling in. Right? So they're participating, they're creating their own language, they're generating meaning from the visuals, although it's probably, again, not as culturally relevant. All right. Here, I'm hoping to demonstrate exploiting or dismantling the audiovisual contract and the audiovisual illusion. So here we'll watch a clip from Amélie, which we've already seen. And, all right, just guide me here, Joey.
Stop sharing.
Okay.
And then move that little arrow.
Okay.
And then share document.
Okay. Then the Amélie. All right.
Amélie a soudain le sentiment étrange d'être en harmonie totale avec elle-même. Tout est parfait en cet instant. La douceur de la lumière, ce petit parfum dans l'air, la rumeur tranquille de la ville. Elle inspire profondément et la vie lui paraît alors si simple et si limpide qu'un élan d'amour, comme un désir d'aider l'humanité entière, la submerge tout à coup.
Venez, je vais vous aider. On descend et hop, c'est parti. Là, on croise la veuve du tambour de la fanfare. Elle porte la vareuse de son mari depuis qu'il est mort. Attention, hop. Tiens, l'enseigne de la boucherie Chevaline a perdu une oreille. Ce rire, c'est celui du mari de la fleuriste. Il a des petites rides de malice au coin des yeux. Oh, dans la vitrine de la pâtisserie, il y a des sucettes Pierrot Gourmand. Vous sentez ce parfum? C'est Pépone qui fait goûter ses melons aux clients.
Allez, allez, goûtez mon melon.
Ah, chez Marion, il faut de la glace au calisson. On passe devant la charcuterie, 79 le jambon à l'os, 45 le travers de micelle. On arrive chez le fromager, 12,90 les picodons de l'Ardèche et 23,50 le cabicou du Poitou. Chez le boucher, il y a un bébé qui regarde un chien qui regarde les poulets rôtis. Voilà, maintenant on est devant le petit kiosque à journaux, juste à l'entrée du métro. Et moi je vous laisse ici. Au revoir.
All right. Stop sharing?
Yep.
All right, so what's going on here? Over and over again in this scene, she's describing something, right? We have, again, what I would sort of call the pretext of the blind man to whom we're describing to show something really fundamental about what happens in cinema, right? So she's naming things, and then the camera does that swish pan, right? And we see the very thing that she's just named, and that happens over and over again, right? Michel Chion, the film sound theorist who I've been mentioning throughout here, talks about a demonstration that he gives to his students where he shows a news clip where the broadcaster is saying, and then there were 3 planes in the sky, and they show 3 planes in the sky. And his students all laugh and say that's really redundant. He says there are 3 planes in the sky, and then he shows it. But if he had said, and now a beautiful day, and you showed the same clip, you would see the beautiful day and think that was redundant, you know. Or now, you know, 1 plane slightly behind the others, you would think that you saw that, right? So it's in fact that the language is structuring what you're seeing, right? So that's that, again, that audio-visual contract at work, right? And then language is, again, anchoring the images, right? Images which you don't have, which don't signify in and of themselves the way that language does. Language allows us to create signification from images. Wrong mouse. Right, so what would I do in the classroom with this? I would maybe first show it without any sound, especially because her language is very rapid fire, very fast, sort of hard to understand, sort of hard even for me to understand, right? So I would have students describe what they see, right? And then we would maybe show it with the dialogue and have them use what they already know they've seen to help understand what she's saying, right? So sort of reverse engineer this scene. Bunch of things you could do with that. You could then take it to another step, take them out into the world, go outside, blindfold one student, and have them replay the same scene, naming what they see. You could even take it one step further and have them make movies doing exactly the same thing, right? Where they demonstrate this audio vision, describing, showing, or breaking down and frustrating that audiovisual contract by saying one thing, showing something else, and then they're making an art film, right? So that's how I would use that. Sound and image synthesis. All right, I'm going to show a clip from the movie Playtime, directed by Jacques Tati, and I would like to know what you would do with this clip. So let's go ahead and look at that, and this will be another opportunity for you to help design your own activity. So stop sharing. Okay.
Allez, je vais prendre un petit gaz, vite fait, mon là.
That's probably actually enough to work with there. All right, so let's take a minute, maybe 3 minutes, do some discussion in group about how you would use this dialogueless clip in a language classroom.
What's the objective? The cars make it still real, like you're actually watching them through the window. So what's the purpose of you watching them through the window? Is to keep connected, but how is that affecting the plot? How is it affecting you in relation to the plot? Or people talking, no, I'm just kidding. Well, I was going to say that for the yeah.
No. Looks like an Edward Hopper painting.
Yeah, totally.
What is the mission of so many movies like this?
Yeah. Sometimes on YouTube, but a lot of times I just know of a movie that I want to use and I get the DVD and yeah. They made these clips for me. From the DVD, the TMC. Made the clips for me, yeah. Let's maybe go ahead and share what you've been brainstorming, and I would love to welcome comments from the chat. We do have one right now. Have students describe a possible dialogue and scenario that would go along with this clip. Fantastic activity.
Is this a black and white or is it a color film?
It's a color film, which we would be able to see a little bit better. But it's true that I think it's deliberately using the lighting to imitate black and white style and referencing silent film in that way.
I would definitely not with no image at all, and write what that is, so they're purely listening. Then I would show this image and do work with that, and not tell them that there was. I really think that the sound and the image are struggling against one another, and you could do so much with just the image if you know, work on adjectives, and you could do the whole mise en scène and sort of break up the analysis, dialogue, and fascinating is this really distracting grading. We're in this other whole world, and not in that one. So it would be interesting to just see what they had to say about the sound, just listening. Where are we?
Yeah, so the comment here was to break up the sound and image, potentially play the sound for students first, ask them to describe what they're hearing, show the clip with no sound, have students do work with that, potentially mise en scène type work, you know, right, creating a dialogue, and then put them back together to demonstrate the extent to which the sound and the image are at odds and are even clashing, right? And of course, the theme of this film, for anyone who's not seen it, is you know, modernity, essentially, right? And especially urban modernity. And the clash between our central character, who's Jacques Tati, famously his Monsieur Hulot character, who's bumbling through modern life, sort of unable to cope, which in the films often comes across through sound. Sound is modernity, right, sort of in these movies. So that clash is absolutely present here. Let's see, describe the relationships among the characters. Excellent, yeah, and as this scene goes on, you could use it. I cut it off for us a little bit preemptively. I think it actually goes on for something like 10 minutes, and you move through this apartment building with just the sound of the cars, and you see all the different apartments, right? So you could actually do much more elaborate work on that level. Question, how many students do you usually have in this kind of class? Having students in groups, do they have enough time to act out their dialogues? When I've done this, I tend to have between 12 and 17 students as our cap, and so I would put students in something like groups of 4 and have 3 or 4 dialogues, and that would mean devoting much or all of a class to this kind of activity. But once you have the film involved, I think it allows you to pace the class nicely, and you could actually take an entire class day and devote it to this. Any other ideas that we want to throw on the table? All right, I think that was a great analysis. I'm really impressed. And I've heard from the genie, the TMC genie here, that perhaps it would be a nice time to take a break. So let's go ahead and break until 5:30, and then come back together for Act 3 editing. Our final unit here is going to be on editing. All right, so the two principals. Hey guys. All right, so Our two major concepts we're going to be talking about are continuity editing and montage. All right, a little bit of the history of editing. Here we have what's considered the first commercial film ever, the Lumiere brothers, Workers Leaving the Lumiere Factory, 1895 film, right? And these actualities had no editing whatsoever. You set up a camera, you taped what was happening, recorded what was happening, and then you showed it, right? And that's what it meant to have a film. But editing began very early on, as early as 1901. If anyone's seen the new Martin Scorsese movie, Hugo, features Georges Méliès, the director who's featured both here and here in double exposure. And through editing tricks, he makes his head go from very small to very large until it eventually explodes. I suggest looking up this film on YouTube. It's pretty funny. The first narrative film is considered The Great Train Robbery, 1903, director Edwin Porter. Right? So what did he do that was different? Instead of having a camera set up showing one thing, we all of a sudden have different scenes. Right? And when we have a big robbery chase at the end, we see what's happening here, and then we see what's happening over here at the same time. Parallel editing, right? So all of a sudden we're driving a story by cutting the film and showing different pieces. Oops, that's not right. All right, so D.W. Griffith is considered the father of continuity editing, and I thought I'd show you just a very short clip about him and about his editing techniques, which can demonstrate far better than I could. All right, here we go.
D.W. Griffith was the first great filmmaker to understand the psychological importance of editing. Working a decade after Porter, he did more than anyone else to advance the storytelling tools Porter had developed. Griffith invented and popularized techniques that established the basic grammar of film. His melodramas were the first to draw audiences into the emotional world of his characters.
He certainly was the first man to use the close-up in a big way.
This was revolutionary. It was so revolutionary that the producers, when they saw this, were aghast. They thought, you can't put this picture out like this. You can't cut to this big, ugly shot of somebody. First of all, we're paying for this actor, this actress. We want to see their whole body. We don't want to just see their face. Second of all, the audiences won't know what to respond to. They're going to be all confused. Well, the proof is in the pudding, and the reality is that the audiences were not confused at all.
Griffith brought it together in one magnificent film, Birth of a Nation, and we saw the accumulation of sort of 10 years of editing knowledge put into a movie. And all of a sudden, you had not only had close-ups, you had flashbacks, parallel action, and you had all sorts of things that he used to make the audience, his attention focused on a certain part of the frame.
D.W. Griffith established the tenets of classical film editing. And classical film editing relied on the concept of the invisible cut, in which action would always be continuous and fluid and moving.
The goal was to mask the cut so the audience wouldn't notice and could forget that they were watching a movie. Let's take another look. Notice how the gesture matches from one shot to the next? Griffith's seamless editing is still practiced today and was the dominant editing style in Hollywood movies for decades.
At last.
Look again. The cut is so smooth that it's barely noticeable.
It's all foretelling the story. And all you want to do is get the person emotionally invested in the story. So it becomes this invisible craft.
We call it the invisible art. And indeed, it is. I mean, the more invisible we are, the better we're doing our job.
All right.
So the narrative film, the editing.
Precisely. The comment was narrative film was born with editing. Exactly right. Narrative is essentially editing combined with sound. Question, are you getting the clips from Safari Montage or from DVDs? I don't know what Safari Montage is, so DVDs, yes, that was the major source of the clips that I'm using here, but also YouTube is a fantastic resource, and you're well within fair use if you're using clips of this length when you get things off of YouTube. I also use a lot of things that are past their copyright. All the silent films that I use are fair use, and you can just download the film right from YouTube, so you don't even have to worry about YouTube going down, and it's there. You can also watch things on YouTube. And if that interests you or it lets you know you're going to want something, you can go get the DVD. But yeah, that's the short answer to where did the clips come from. All right, so continuity editing. We just saw the basic principles, that it was a dominant editing style of Hollywood and commercial film. Main purpose is to tell a story, very narratively driven, emphasizes spatial and temporal continuity, hence continuity editing. Creates a smooth flow. We saw that demonstrated really well from shot to shot. Intended to be as invisible and seamless as possible, right? We saw that echoed in editors themselves describing their craft. Enables a story to be narrated without disruption and disorientation for the viewer, right? So just as classical film sound is aimed at absorption, here we have maximum or the least amount of disruption and disorientation. Right, so the shot, reverse shot, this is where it would have been helpful if we'd watched Casablanca, right, is a well-known film technique that if you imagine a dialogue scene in a film, you immediately know what shot, reverse shot is, right? We're at the same level, going back and forth between characters. That's when we see reaction shots, right? And we know where they are. We can imagine them in space. We're not all of a sudden looking up at one character and then looking down at another character. We maintain the same eye level, and we implicitly understand that it's them looking at each other, right? That we're in the perspective of one character or another. An example of discontinuity editing, which is generally associated with avant-garde, non-narrative art cinema, right, would be the jump cut. And we'll be looking at an example of this later on in Jean Godard's Breathless. But these are actually two shots that come one right after the other, right? So all of a sudden, we're taken out of the film, right? It's the non-absorbative watching. It's discontinuous, it disrupts us, and that's the goal, right? So editing not only creates narrative, it's also what keeps you in or all of a sudden draws you back out of the narrative world of the film. Now, montage, when I say montage, we're not talking about the scenes in films like the Rocky training montage or the Pretty Woman shopping montage. We're talking about an editing principle innovated by mostly Soviet film theorists in the 1920s. Right? And it's the juxtaposition of disparate images. So this is distinct both from continuity editing and from discontinuity style editing. What montage does is it places two different images next to each other such that they give rise to a third thing, the famous tertium quid, right, that is not in either of the images or any of the images if there are more than two. And we'll look at some examples of this. Right. This is Eisenstein, who famously theorized montage originally, an idea that derives from the collision between two shots that are independent of each other. Right, so you can see that also ideologically this is going to be very distinct from the goal of absorption of continuity editing and narrative. Right, so these are both stills from, but images that are juxtaposed in Eisenstein's famous Odessa stairs sequence of the battleship Potemkin. Right, so here we have the baby going down the stairs. We see this man. We see this woman. Right? And we might interpret these things differently, but whatever we interpret is something that's not in any of these images themselves. How would you, if you saw these three images played one right after another, just to brainstorm a little bit, what would you understand? What might you understand? Narratively, symbolically, this. Some kind of disaster going on, general violence, right? What's famously unclear in this sequence is whether or not this man is responsible for pushing the baby, or if he's supposed to have just slapped this woman, right? Because there's nothing that orients us in this scene to know where these people are in relation to each other, where they are in relation to each other temporally in this very long scene that takes much longer than it would in reality, because we're in the world of montage and not continuity editing that wants to reproduce a sort of temporal realism. This scene, potentially the most famous, that comes at the end of the Odessa Steppe sequence, we see 3 different statues of lions, here, here, here. Together, not only do we have the impression of lion in motion, but we're also given a sense of the need to rise up, to awaken, right? It's carrying a political content here as well, right? So there's something that is produced by these images when they're put next to each other that is not in any of them individually, right? So this is the shock, the collision of images that Eisenstein is talking about. Go. Nope. All right. Now we'll watch a pretty wonderful demonstration of what montage can do. And this is based on a famous effect known as the Kuleshov effect after, where is it? There we go. After the Russian theorist who first came up with it. Here we go.
Now the third way is what one might call pure cinematics, assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up. Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees. And he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his 2 pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a film of a girl in a bikini. Looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? He's a dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
Or you for it.
All right, that's what film can do for you. Go back here. All right, so that was displaying both continuity editing and montage, right? Because we understood that we were in a shot, reverse shot scenario that put the characters in the same time and same place, right? So it's exploiting that, but then also exploiting the effects of montage to make us understand something in the mind of the character, which is, of course, not there in the shot at all. If it were there in the shot, we wouldn't have seen it differently the 2 times, right? It's in the montage. It's only in the montage. The tertium quid. And it's exactly the principle that Hitchcock uses to make Rear Window. In Rear Window, the Jimmy Stewart character is looking out of his window. He's the Hitchcock from the scene we just saw. He's looking out at things. He's looking back. Pure cinema. Okay. All right, so using editing in the classroom, a few suggestions. They're of a slightly different nature from some of the other ones. Use stills to let students become film editors. Exploit the tertium quid and Kuleshov effect, what we just saw, to generate language and narrative, invite students to create their own continuity and montage films, and analyze how editing techniques relate to sound, narrative, and aesthetic effect. So let's take a look at a few examples of those. So here, a very simple activity. I just took a scene from, in this case, Breakfast at Tiffany's, because I thought it was a film that we might know. Here we have an establishing shot of the 2 characters, and then I promise you the way that I created this was I watched the scene on YouTube. I said Breakfast at Tiffany's final scene. It came up on YouTube. I captured the images and created this. It was very simple. And then you have their reaction shots. They're talking to each other. You have the students arrange them and You can either have them write a dialogue that's going along with that, you can have them tell the story, right? And I've referred to these as intertitles, which you may remember in silent film, those things that would come up between the images. So they're creating their own silent film style film, but they'll understand readily that this is a conversation happening and that you can create a story out of it. Right, so they're the editors. Here, you can do the same thing, but on a broader scale, now not within one scene, but just give them a bunch of images. This would probably be too much, I realize, right? But rearrange the images to produce a narrative and then tell your story, right? Very basic, but using montage effects, continuity editing, not so much, but very much that third thing, that tertium quid, right? Because all they're doing is putting images next to each other in order to generate a story, in order to generate psychological interiority, etc. You could also do this, this is something we were discussing during the break, you could do this with a film that you're going to show them before they see it. You could take the stills, have them create their own story, then show them the film. How is this different? That's something that I've also done in the classroom. How is the story that you created different from the actual film? Activity 3, invite students to create their own continuity and montage films, right? So this would be a slightly more advanced level where maybe you wanted to teach them the difference between those two techniques. And then you could give them a dialogue. Give them, it could be a radio dialogue, it could be TV, it could be a film. Take away the image, play the dialogue for them, have them create the visuals, right? So more on the comprehension end than on the production end. They could storyboard it. They could actually film it, right? They could use iMovie. They know how to do these things, I promise. It comes very easily to them at this point, right? They can actually make the visuals, right? So the inverse of the dubbing in this scenario. Do the editing. Have them demonstrate continuity editing. Have them demonstrate montage. All right, so our final activity and the final thing that I will ask of you is to watch a scene and generate a few ideas about what you could do with it. And then we'll conclude. So watching a scene, I promised I would show you the jump cut, and it's going to be in this scene. All right, we have subtitles here.
Pourquoi tu cruais?
90 seconds.
Où est-ce qu'il y a des taxis?
Bon, très bien, ma voiture est à l'opéra. Tu veux que je te dépose?
Ok. Et ta Ford, tu ne l'as plus?
Elle est au garage. Allez, quoi, je reste avec toi.
De toute façon, j'ai mal à la tête.
On ne sera pas ensemble, mais je voudrais rester à côté de toi.
Non, ce n'est pas ça, Michel. Pourquoi vous êtes triste?
Parce que je suis triste.
C'est idiot. Pourquoi tu es triste? C'est mieux quand je dis vous ou tu.
Pareil, je peux pas me passer de toi.
Tu peux très bien.
Oui, mais je veux pas. Regarde une Talbot, elle est belle, 2,5 litres.
Tu es un garçon.
Quoi?
Je ne sais pas.
Patricia, regarde-moi. C'est interdit d'aller voir Steve. Hélas, hélas, hélas. J'aime une fille qui a une très jolie nuque, de très jolis seins, une très jolie voix, de très jolis poignets, un très joli front, de très jolis genoux. Mais qui est lâche.
C'est là, stop.
Attends, je vais me garer, quoi.
Non, c'est inutile.
Bon.
All right. Oh, sorry. So let's take about 5 minutes before we conclude to brainstorm what you could do with that crazy scene. All right. Go back into groups.
Trying to follow it.
You can have them on, take them off.
I'm happy because he wants to stay over at her place and she says no. Exactly. Not even flowers.
He stole a car for her.
Well, he borrowed it because his other one's in the garage.
Right.
He's trying to park it. Even though he's been married, right?
All right, I'm excited to hear what you made of this, I think, very challenging scene. And I tried to throw something very challenging at you at the end to see what we could do with all the elements that we've been working with today. So welcome comments here at WNL and also in the chat.
So I think what I would do is get rid of the subtitle. Dialogues, and when she was speaking about it, and have them write them.
So great ideas here. Taking away the subtitles because they're very distracting, and as anyone who speaks French might have noticed, also not correct in certain instances here because there are cultural things the subtitles can't deal with. But then having them watch it and potentially taking away the soundtrack, creating their own soundtrack or giving them several possibilities and seeing how they interpret the scene with different soundtrack over it. Great ideas.
Well, because you don't give even the lyrics. They kind of tell you words to the dialogue. What do you think they're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Put words to the dialogue. What do you think they're saying? I will admit I've actually used this in a beginning level class to teach body parts, right? Because he's listing the body parts.
Back and forth, connect eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And if you want to work with
Yeah, so the next time they meet, write a dialogue about what happens after she gets out of the car and they see each other again. What happens in the movie is they end up spending about a 45-minute scene in her apartment. Another great possibility. I see that there's been a question. It looks like it's not specifically about this scene, so maybe I'll wait till we're done talking about this. Or maybe we are. Maybe we are. I think we've had some good ideas.
Bills, I would guess that this would, I mean, there's so many. Or do you do something with continuity? Is there a way to date that? Maybe like what we're saying with the music, I mean, because you after you do the montage and
Mm-hmm.
the third, well, you know.
So what would I do with this in terms of editing?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is just a tremendously, like, seemingly very simple, but in fact very complex still. And the way that I would talk about editing would be, you know, show this film to a group of students and say, what don't we see? What do we maybe expect to see, right? We never see him the whole time he's talking. And then what's the relationship between sound and image? Because we have continuous dialogue when he's talking over jump cuts of her, right? So we have that disjunction between those two things. And even something as basic as, what does this tell us about the relationship between these two characters? What effect does it have on you as a viewer? Just sort of very basic, attuning them to pay attention to those technical elements. All right, so let's maybe open it up for general questions. I will put back up here my overview to wrap up. Right, so here's just an overview to remember where we've been, what we've seen, what we've learned. I see that there are a number of French teachers here at Roanoke County. This is a question, Roanoke County Schools, and we were wondering if you could name some French films or other that have been particularly useful for French classes. We teach French 1 through French AP. Rather than answering that off the cuff in a possibly not very helpful way, I would love to make a document like that available. And I'll make sure that Dick can have that up, maybe along with this PowerPoint. That would be probably a more useful resource. And then, well, and the one thing I will say about that right now is that some films are more useful than others, and films are more useful for teaching certain things. I love teaching Tati films and Hitchcock films because they are full of those silent film moments, right, that just give you so much to work with, right? Those are two examples. Hitchcock, obviously, not so much in French classes. Godard is really great for doing things that are not classical Hollywood narrative, and when you want to get students to pay attention, sort of understand what the conventions are through the people who break them.
I discovered that also the French films are also exploring different cultures, like Spanish, because the 10th film last year, they were putting prestigious in.
Oh, interesting.
For other languages, not only French.
So mentioning certain French films that use other cultures and other languages within them, right? So that gives you...
And they use diversity too. They use diversity because they were a gender, they have different...
We had different cultures, genders, very diverse material within the film. Great. Okay, any other questions? You mentioned at the beginning the fact that students are interested in movies. It's particularly engaging for them. Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. But that doesn't mean, I mean, the balance I think that is important to strike is you use films because they're engaging, and then you exploit that interest. Maybe it's too harsh a thing to say, but you use that interest to lead them into a place where you can then complicate that interest, enrich it, challenge it through films that maybe aren't adhering to continuity editing, classic Hollywood narrative styles in order to make them analyze that enjoyment. So depending on what level. And here's some resources, and just so that you know that these are available. Print resources, textbooks, and then some more sophisticated film theory to consult if that interests you. And finally, these websites that I found while I was doing research for this presentation that are just tremendously helpful. EL Film Studies, slightly more academic, but this website that's here at the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences is very, very useful. I think very clear, very comprehensible, and is aimed at teachers, as you can see. So really pedagogically valuable. The AMC film site is surprisingly good, and then the Dartmouth writing program, if you wanted to have your students writing not film reviews, but actually doing film analysis and essays, they have a really good guide to how to go about doing that. Oh, wow. So comment that the University of Virginia website, in Spanish at least, has a variety of films along with activities that you can do with them available. I don't speak Spanish, so I'm not. Oh. I'm going to let you put this up on the website. All right. I'm not going to attempt Spanish in front of language teachers. And that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for listening and watching.